The other thing I want to mention is we will also be having a public health seminar series on next Monday. I just received that information. It'll be Carla Bird, who is a tribal outreach specialist with the University of Montana. And the title of her presentation next Monday, March 6th at 2 p.m. is Culture and Public Health, Applied Indigenous Intervention and Educational Practice. So please be sure to join us both in person in SCAGS 174 or online via Zoom. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. James Karinji. He will be introducing our guest speakers for today. Jim, it's all yours.
Thanks, Patrick, and hello, everybody. I'm Jim Karinji, professor in public health. I was some of you probably know me as being across the Oval as a professor in social work for many years, and I've moved over here. I'm also involved in the Center for Population Health Research. And today I have the pleasure of introducing our two guest speakers. A little background, through a generous private donation, we've been able to form a lab research group here at the School of Public and Community Health Sciences that we call the DART Lab, that is Developmental Adversity, Resilience, and Transformation, which is the topic that our speakers will be talking about today. They're truly experts in that area. So Dr. Siwen Minero has a EDD from the Harvard School of Education. She's a qualitative researcher that has conducted extensive studies in the US and China with an emphasis on civics and civic engagement. She is interested in understanding human interactions, how to effectively use sciences of developmental adversity, for example, neurosciences, epigenetics, and ACEs to improve children's well-being, and how to build on the power of relationships and systems to facilitate success in endeavors that fuels success in the next generation. So, and then also Dr. Krista Goldstine Cole also has a degree from the School of the Education at Harvard in an EDD. She's always been interested in young people, their well-being, and the systems that serve them. She has followed that interest as a teacher in government and also as a researcher. And you'll see that Dr. Goldstine Cole is also underspoken about her achievements. She has done much. Thanks for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim. And thanks everybody for being here. I know that this is usually like in person or mixed and you're all on Zoom just for us today, which we appreciate because Siwen and I do both work at a distance. I'm in Denver and Siwen is in LA, and we are probably the world's luckiest girls today, both because we get to work together and also because we have recently been welcomed to the University of Montana. And we're really grateful for the opportunity to be at a school that offers such amazing opportunities to students and to build research that's important to the well-being of all of us. So we're very happy to be here. Today, our talk is called Leveraging the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study for Transformation and Capacity Building. So, my slides do not want to advance. Okay, there we go. So we're gonna have the talk basically in three parts today. First, Siwen's going to talk about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. The second part, we're going to talk about those two parts of transformational learning and building capacity for change. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about building a research agenda, and we'll open it to discussion. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, so we would like to ask you, we have, I think, 4 points in the conversation where we've left space for questions, so if you could hold them till that time or put them into the chat, that would be terrific. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Siwen.
Thank you, Krista, for getting us started, and welcome everybody. Very appreciative for your presence here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Adverse Childhood Experiences, the ACE study. So this was a study that was conducted by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. It was actually a longitudinal epidemiological study of adults receiving preventative care through Kaiser in San Diego. And the sample included over 17,000 adults who were primarily white, college educated, and middle class. And each person was asked to answer 70 questions about childhood adversity using a mix of original questions and questions from standardized instruments such as the conflict tactics scale. And answers to these questionnaire were matched to past medical records and medical usage moving forward. And over time, researchers were also able to match to death certificates. And there have been over 80 publications from the ACE study, with the first being published in 1998. So what are the ACEs? So this study asked about 3 categories of experiences prior to age 18. So abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, limited to home experience while growing up. And the study occurred in 2 waves. In the first wave, there were no questions regarding neglect. And in the second wave, researchers asked about physical and emotional neglect. And in both studies, participants were asked about physical, sexual, and emotional or verbal abuse, having a depressed, mentally ill, or suicidal caregiver, substance abuse in the home, witnessing intimate partner violence, parental divorce or separation, and incarceration of any family member. So a key finding of the study is really that a significant portion of the population has experienced each of the ACEs. As you can see on the slide, ACEs are common. And a second key finding of the study is the interrelatedness of the ACEs. So these studies are from the CDC's roll-up of BRFIS results across more than 20 states. BRFIS is the behavioral risk factor surveillance system that some of you might have heard of. And if you read across the ACE literature, you will find a little bit of variation in these numbers. These are numbers from wave 1, wave 2, and combined waves. In addition, most states have begun to ask about ACEs on the BRFIS, the surveillance system. And as you can see, a significant portion of the population reports multiple ACEs. And the result is extremely consistent across large populations. And so as you can see on the slide, only 36% of the population has no ACEs, and another 26 has 1 ACE. So nearly half of the population has multiple ACEs. And that's important because the third key finding is the dose-response relationship. So the dose-response relationship shows that as the dose increases, so does the health response. So you're probably very familiar with this common measure in public health. But if we're spending half a day together, we will show you just how steep the dose response curve is for different health conditions. But instead, today, we'll just give you a quick snapshot of the range of health outcomes that are associated with the accumulation of ACEs. So as you can see on the slide, physical, mental, behavioral, relational, and financial health are each impacted by ACEs. Replication studies and further analysis of the ACE data over time have verified this list and expanded on it as well. But importantly, the ACE questionnaire has been used with more narrow populations like kids in juvenile justice systems and adults using Medicaid. And while the portion of these population with multiple ACEs is higher, the dose-response relationship is still constant. So what does this mean in the real world for people and for systems that serve them? Let's look at the population attributable risk, or PAR, which some of you might be familiar with. It's just fancy math that lets us break down how much of a disease can be attributed to a particular disease agent or risk factor. So with some things, it's easy. We know that 100% of getting COVID, for example, is attributable to the coronavirus. Whereas on the other hand, the severity of COVID and getting long COVID involves some other health factors. And here's what we know about population attributable risk for several outcomes associated with ACEs. So if we were to imagine in a big room full of 1,000 people, approximately 360 people will report having experienced no ACEs growing up. and approximately 515 will report having 1 to 3 ACEs. And the remaining 125 would report 4 to 10 ACEs. And now let's look at the difference in risk for 5 health outcomes. On average, 1 in 16 people with no ACEs will smoke in their lifetime, whereas 1 in 9 people with 3 ACEs will smoke, and 1 in 6 with 7 or more ACEs will smoke. And since you're all are in public health, you know what that means for other health outcomes. And when we look at alcohol, the results are more stunning, right? 1 in 69 people with no ACEs consider themselves to be alcoholics, whereas 1 in 9 people with 3 ACEs and 1 in 6 people with 7 and more ACEs experience alcoholism. And only a tiny, tiny fraction of people with no ACEs, here, 1 in 480, has ever tried IV drugs. And more than 10 times that number of people with 3 ACEs, so here 1 in 43, has ever tried IV drugs, and 1 in 30 people with 7 or more ACEs has done so. And so on a practical level, this means that nearly all IV drug use is attributable to ACEs. And when it comes to heart health, 1 in 14 people with no ACEs experience ischemic heart disease, compared to 1 in 7 for 3 ACEs and 1 in 6 for 7 or more ACEs. So the risk more than doubles as the ACE count rises. And lastly, let's look at suicide. And we want to just acknowledge that these data are from before the recent rise in suicide, but rather than invalidating that data, these new and alarming trends should really invite us to look more deeply at what is influencing current outcomes. So as you can see, among people with no ACEs, about 1% report ever attempting suicide, while 10% with 3 ACEs and fully 20%, so 1 in 5 people with 7 or more ACEs, have attempted suicide. So how does this happen? Why is childhood experience so closely tied to health risk across the lifespan? So in the 1990s, when the ACE study was first came out, the prevailing theory was imitation or learned behavior. So in other words, individuals adopted poor health behaviors. And what we have learned since then is that there are several very powerful biological processes that embed ACEs into the body. And we would nerd out about this all day, but we won't. So instead, we'll give you the super short, super simplified Cliff Notes version of these 3 systems impacted by stress hormones: the brain, the epigenome, and the gut microbiome. And we used to call this neuroscience, which is short for neurobiology, epigenetic resilience, and ACEs. But the science is moving really quickly. And in the last 3 years, the role of the gut microbiome and its communication with other body systems really has emerged as the next great frontier of understanding how developmental adversity gets under the skin. And I'm hearing some echoes. Let's see. Okay, much better. Thank you. So one of the key places that childhood adversity shows up is in the brain. So according to this terrific body of work by McLaughlin and colleagues, we know that the exact consequences of ACEs on the brain depend on the type and timing of maltreatment as well as gender. But in every case, the stress of ACEs cause the production of stress hormones like cortisol, which trigger changes in the developmental process. And again, in broad strokes, brain chemistry, brain region development, and the network architecture are driven by the stress response. And very importantly, the chemical makeup of the body, whether that's happy hormones or stress hormones, at critical developmental moments, sets the basic level of body chemistry. So if a child is highly stressed, their base rate of chemistry will have more stress hormones. And if a child is super happy, then they will naturally have more happy hormones. And you all have heard about the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for anxiety and fear, is one part of the brain that gets better and better at producing a chemical reaction every time there is exposure to stress hormones. So it's not at all surprising that the population exposed to ACEs tends to have a lot of anxiety, as we showed before. And the chemical mixture caused by ACEs also impacts the development of functional brain regions. So for example, cortisol can interfere with the process of myelination. So myelin is a fat that insulates nerves and constitutes white matter in the brain. And disruption in myelination affects the size, the shape, and the functionality of the corpus callosum, which regulates the communication between the two hemispheres in the brain. And the most recent breakthroughs in developmental neurobiology show that the network of connection in the brain is also impacted by ACEs. So a researcher named Kyoto Ohashi, her work really shows that the greater the stress, the weaker the network connections in 9 regions of the brain are. So the hubs are smaller and weaker, and the connection between the hubs are less robust. She calls this the small worldness. Some of us may have been educated with the belief that genes are dominant and recessive and expressed at birth, but recent science has told us that this is not really the case. And we know that all the cells in our body are the same, so they all have matched pairs of chromosomes. And yet when we look into the mirror, we can clearly see our eyeballs look different from our teeth and our skin, and our heart is different from our kidneys and our brain. And that's what's called cell differentiation. Different genes are turned on or off inside each specialized cell. And we've known this for a long time, more than half a century, but there's actually increasing research, such as in the study of cancer, has taught us that individual genes can be turned on and off even long after cell differentiation occurs in utero. And we know, for example, that there is a gene by experience interaction that can lead to previously inactive genes being turned on and off. And this process is called epigenetics. And there are a couple of different processes leading to this kind of gene expression. And the most common and getting a lot of traction is called methylation. And from an evolutionary point of view, a robust gene by experience or gene by environment interaction ensures the best fit to our environment, or the best as also survival. And finally, within epigenetics is the phenomenon of frayed telomeres. Telomeres are little casing at the end of each chromosome, and they are like the little plastic wrappers on your shoelaces. And when they break down, aging happens. This is a process called fraying. And we know that one way developmental adversity gets under the skin is through this fraying of telomeres. And it causes the aging, and it helps to explain why we see things like early heart attack in individuals with high ACEs. And the third major system we're just going to introduce and gloss over today is the gut microbiome. And honestly, what we have learned about the gut in the 21st century is so fascinating. We could spend the whole day on this and more. But today we're just gonna have a few minutes and talk briefly about it. So our gut is full of flora, like bacteria. A significant portion of that microbiome is handed down from the mother during pregnancy and birth. So kids born via C-section have very different microbiomes from their mother than from any siblings born vaginally. And in addition, body chemistry can eliminate some flora. It can also cause other forms of microbes and bacteria to grow. And unfortunately, stress hormones have this effect of killing the healthiest stuff and causing imbalance in the gut. And right now, there are 2 reasons we know this is important. First, the gut communicates with other major systems in the body, especially the immune system, the brain, and the heart. And imbalance in the microbiome influence those communications in ways that are not healthy. Second, the gut is responsible for more than 3/4 of all serotonin production. So serotonin, as you know, is a key ingredient in regulating depression. So the less healthy the gut, the less serotonin production and the more depression. So it's no wonder that we see 2/3 of all depression is attributable to ACEs at a population level. All right, so I know that's a lot of information. We'll pause for any quick questions before we move on. feel free to put it in the chat or just turn on the mic, or we can address these towards the end.
I'll give you a second. All right. No questions? Perfect, Siwen. You did a perfect job, perfect job, I guess. Now we're going to switch over to part 2 of our talk today. And it's important to know that we are not biological scientists. We are social scientists, and we would like to spend the rest of our time on the community health side of the equation. So let's start here, just recognizing that you heard Siwen use the word developmental adversity at different times in her talk. And we really do like the expression developmental adversity as an umbrella term for all of those adversities, traumas, and significant stressors that have this effect of altering brains, bodies, or the developmental trajectory. And one of the things we'd like to acknowledge here is that we could talk about, like so many things, we could talk about developmental trajectories all day long. Both Siwen and I have our EDDs in human development, but we're going to skip that part altogether today. We're not going to talk about developmental trajectories at all. I did put the slides in and then I took them out because I didn't want us to, try to keep you in the room all afternoon. So, what we'd like to do first here is just take a little bit of a look at the difference between developmental adversity and the adverse childhood experiences study. So the first important thing is that the ACE study is specifically limited to the first 18 years of life. The research goal was to examine childhood. But what we know is that developmental adversity can occur at any time in the life course. People can encounter traumas and significant stressors that are sufficient to alter development as it moves forward through adulthood. Secondly, the ACE study was designed to document what happens inside the family and home. And sometimes people, critique the researchers for not considering things like racism and discrimination or community exposure. But again, the study was designed specifically to examine what happens inside the home growing up. And developmental adversity as a term is meant to help us acknowledge and broaden the focus to understand that other things in the developmental context or in the environment can impact development. One thing that we know to be true is that ACEs provides a very powerful and incredibly predictive measure of developmental adversity. What happens in childhood is something that we build on across our lifespan. And so that makes what happens in childhood much more powerful in terms of health and developmental outcomes down the line. And finally, it's not on this slide, but I do just want to mention that there are professions, especially mental health professions and medical professions, in which trauma is a very specific, has very specific life-threatening qualities to it. And some of the ACEs rise to the level of trauma and others do not. So we've embraced this term of developmental adversity to sort of take a broader view, recognizing that ACEs and the ACE study continue to be one of the most powerful measures that we have. The ACE study remains the gold standard in public health. Its findings have been replicated in a variety of ways. None of the replications have been as large as the original ACE study, but it has been replicated in a number of ways across a variety of special populations, including incarcerated youth. But ACEs do not tell us everything. I think I'm off by a slide. So yeah, I am off by a slide. Here we go. It's okay. I'll just turn the page. So we're going to talk today. So we're going to talk a little bit about our broader interests in developmental adversity. And one of the and developmental adversity education. So that's where our current research is located. So you may, depending on what your practice is, you may have noticed that there is really a significant amount of interest in training or education about developmental adversity. And we mean that as the learning, training, or education about ACEs, neuroscience, trauma-informed, toxic stress, and adjacent topics. And right now, one thing that's true is that both policymakers and funders are really pushing for more education, more workforce development, more training, more community education as part of a broader theory of change. And that theory of change is that if you teach it, it will change, right? So we have strong beliefs that changes in people, behaviors, and systems is driven by learning. And so many of our current research questions are focused on this theory of change. Is it true? There's actually not very much research that tells us if it's true. When is it true? For whom is it true? Under what circumstances can we begin to see transformational change in people and systems driven by learning? And as we have focused on these questions, we've really begun to explore the idea of transformation and transformational learning. And we're deeply informed by the work of Jack Mesereau, who first articulated transformational learning theory in the 1990s. He described transformation as a process in which individuals encounter something that really shakes their assumptions. And together with our colleagues in developmental adversity education, we have found that learning about a study can really shake people to their core. For example, when we learn that ACEs change the brain, epigenome, the gut microbiome, and some psychosocial processes such that addiction emerges as a rational and helpful behavior for people exposed to ACEs, it really can change our beliefs about what is addiction? Is there a moral component to it? There's a very strong cultural belief that, addiction is a moral failing, for example. But this science really teaches us that there's a deep biological and psychosocial component to it. So having encountered such an event or such new information that really does shake us, Mesereau argues that we go through a number of steps to learn what other people believe and why. Do other people have a different worldview about addiction, for example? And then we begin to imagine new skills and new roles, the kinds of skills that we need in new roles. And once we've integrated all this learning, then we step back into our world as actors with a new worldview. Now, Mesereau confined most of his research to being about cognition, changes in thinking and knowing, but others have come behind him. For example, Dirks has done very interesting work around how the spirit and the affect can be transformed through these learning processes. And Freire has explored the ways in which transformative learning sort of changes our sense of social justice and equity in the world. So what we'd like to do is to show you sort of the history of our current research, which started with a video project in the spring of 2021. And it was not research. It wasn't meant to be research. It was meant to be a video project. And we were building on our own professional experience and the experiences of our colleagues at ANS Research in providing developmental adversity education. And we noticed that you can fill up a ballroom with lots of people, and some of them will just catch fire and they will just really want to take ACEs and developmental adversity back into the world and make huge changes. And others are like, well, I'm done with my continuing professional education for the year, and they move on. And so we wanted to know, like, who catches fire and how do they get excited and why? So we went and we interviewed 10 people that we knew from our professional experience as innovators and leaders in the world of developmental adversity education. And we had long interviews with them, but the very last question is, can you summarize your learning using the format I used to think and now I think? And so we're going to share with you 3 examples that we think are very representative of personal, professional, and social justice transformation out of that video project.
You know, I guess my first instinct is to say, I used to think that the way I felt was my fault. And now I think that the way I felt and feel is a reaction to and from all of the things that I've experienced in my life, both positive and negative. And so I guess like, I don't have this as much anymore, thank God, because I've done therapy and I've done a 12-step program and I continue to do all those things, meditation and what have you. But, you know, I walked around for years with what they call in the 12-step program, you know, a hole in your soul, or, you know, just this like gnawing feeling in my gut, like this, it was an anxiety was probably a lot of what it was, and fear and, you know, GI issues and all these other things. But I thought that was all because of who I was as a person, like that. That was just, you know, my constitution. And I didn't realize that that was actually a physiological response to the trauma that I had survived as a child. And so instead of seeing myself as a victim, I now see myself as a survivor. So, you know, I used to think I was a victim and now I think I'm a survivor. And I used to think, you know, I was destined to live a certain life. And now I know that I'm resilient and I can move beyond that. And not to say that there aren't going to be days where I am triggered and I'm affected by those things. And what I'm learning now in my therapy that's really important is, and it's hard for me because I'm still working on it, but, you know, I used to think that recognizing adversity and trauma was weak, you know, and now I think that recognizing and understanding and accepting adversity and trauma is the strongest and best thing I could do for myself.
I used to think that the trauma or difficult upbringings that my students had gone through directly just affected their immediate future, their drug use, or you know, their acting out behaviors, maybe their tendency to get incarcerated even. But now I know that those adverse childhood experiences have an impact on possibly their whole lives, maybe even some of their own children's lives, and that it can greatly affect their long-term health.
I think I was clueless about how cruel we are every single day. And there's a traumatic aspect to it. There's a transgenerational trauma. There's also a daily battering of children's identity. So we've got to work really closely with the equity folks to come together. How are we going to bring together this notion of trauma and equity and racism?
Seeing these and other videos from the leaders that we talked with was truly inspirational to us. And it led us to ask a number of questions about how does this happen? How do these incredible people go from learning that developmental adversity is a thing, like it happens and it makes changes in people's lives, to doing the kind of deep self-exploration, professional exploration that they have done, and doing the kind of work. For example, the last person there was Susan Cole, whose work in trauma-informed schools has led the nation for well more than a decade. So we got extremely interested in how you leverage this kind of education and what is it that we need to know. So that is where our current research is, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other place where we think that there's a great deal of leverage that occurs in what's called capacity building. And capacity building is often it's something that is quite prevalent in public health, and it often centers on how you build the community. But I think you'll see from the next video that we're going to share with you that can also be referenced to an individual or to a profession. This is one of many capacity building models that's out there. It comes to us from Laura Porta and Rob Anda, and it's meant to be a continuous cycle that includes developing and expanding leadership, expanding focus on understanding what's happening with developmental adversity, learning both more about the science and more about what our effects our actions are having in the world, and focusing on results by keeping track of particular goals and often data around those goals and evaluating where we are in terms of achieving them. So I'm going to share one more video with you. This video is quite stunning, and we will have a moment to talk about it when it's done. I really, really appreciate the honesty that Laura Hodges shares in this video as someone who's worked for an entire career in the Department of Corrections, and who spent the first almost 20 years of that career inside of a prison.
I said earlier, the first 18 years I spent in uniform. So I saw a prisoner was a prisoner was a prisoner, right? That is what it is. You know, we had 2,500 prisoners, and that was it. I didn't see individuals. I saw a blue and orange jumpsuit and 6 digits on their back. By shifting that paradigm, again, it was giving that humanity back to them, treating them as individuals. So what I used to think was that, you know, they're just a prisoner, and now they're an individual, they're a human, they're a person. And actually having those conversations as though they were a person, that they're a human being that is there and they have some needs. And why we have them, how is it that I help you find those individual needs and risks? And how do we work on them, why we have you, you know, why you're in these programs. So a complete shift in paradigm of how I used to think. I know people that knew me 10 years ago as a lieutenant or whatever that position was. I was on our emergency response team. I had a helmet and a shield, right? So that's totally different than the person they see now that teaches communication and teaches trauma and teaches ACEs and NEAR, all these different things. So as my training cadre likes to think, if we can change Laura, we can change anybody. We can shift that paradigm for anybody. Because I probably was a little resistant to it at first because I didn't understand it and I didn't know what it meant and why we would use this information. But again, my goal is to make it a safer prison and make it a safer community and help them find that path, and then their children and their children and their children of finding that path.
So, thank you. So I'm sure that was very inspiring to all of you. And we'll have a minute to talk. Well, in a minute, we'll have the opportunity to talk about the videos and the content of the videos, as well as some of the science that we have presented. We do really appreciate having the opportunity to come to University of Montana as researchers, and we look forward to working with all of you as colleagues moving forward. Right now, what we're doing is we are translating this inspiration that we had having done this video project and having sparked what we call epistemic emotions, which are things like awe and curiosity, having those sparked for us in these videos, we are trying to translate that into research. So right now we have a study in the field at this time. It is a two-part study. In one part, there are 35 interviews that we're conducting with leaders in the field of developmental adversity. And then we have a survey that's in the field. So if you'd like to help, there are lots of ways that you could. If you have spent at least a year learning about developmental adversity, and that can be personal study like we saw with Melanie, it can be taking a training, for example, Dr. Krinji's a trained master trainer, so you may have taken some ACE training or NEAR training from him, or you might have teach classes or been in classes where you have learned about ACEs. So if you've engaged in developmental adversity education, feel free to take the survey. The link is here, and I think that Siwen just put it into the chat as well. And if you have taught others, or you know of others who have engaged in DA learning, you can certainly get them to the survey. Second, as we are testing a transformation index. So we're developing questions specific to DA learning that are tied to Minero and others' work. And we're going to do a retest of that index for reliability purposes. So we'll be honest here. If you are a statistics nerd and doing the work around a retest sounds exciting to you, we would welcome your help every day of the week, and then some. And then finally, if you have interest in helping us to build out a research agenda, we'd love to have your input. We would like to thank our funder, as Jim mentioned at the beginning. We're at Montana thanks to an incredibly generous gift from the NSR Foundation, and we always want to recognize them not only for their funding, but for their collegialities and the ways that they have helped us grow over the past 3 years together as researchers. And so with that, we will open it up for questions, ideas, discussion. We have about 7 minutes before anyone is late. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that we can see folks.
Well, thank you, Krista and Siwen. Yes, if anyone has any questions for our presenters today, please go ahead and you can either put them in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask them directly.
Gosh, I haven't seen such a shy group in a really long time.
They are quiet.
Let's try something. Let's try something to get you guys warmed up. Let's just have you use your reaction buttons and give us a show of hands if you were familiar with the ACE study before today. So it looks like lots of folks knew this study. Let's ask you this then. How many of you, when you first encountered ACEs or the biological sciences associated with it, like neurobiology, how many of you would say that was one of those experiences that Minero describes as like really challenging the worldview that you held, either about science or about how people behave in the world? Did anyone experience the study in that way? Interesting. Nathan says yes. Nathan, would you be willing to start us off and elaborate a little bit? All right. Deshane says, and that he's asking us if we could speak a little about positive childhood experiences.
Hi, Hi, I'm sorry. This is Nathan. It took me a while to get onto the right place to press the mute button. So yeah, I mean, just to when I first heard about ACEs, it made a lot of sense just off the top, but I never really put it together. I think I can reflect that I saw most things in just more biological terms, I suppose, and just characteristic terms, and didn't really look at it with the ACE study itself. The thing that I think was most amazing to me is the dose dependency. I just find that really quite incredible. So,
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that is a good bridge to this question that Deshane has put in the chat about, could you speak a little bit about PCs or positive childhood experiences and strength-based research that is beginning to take place? Do you feel like it will complement the ACE work or juxtapose it? Okay, so just a little bit of a disclaimer here. This is where I did my dissertation. So if I sound traumatized, I probably am. So there is this movement, for those of you who aren't familiar, moving towards putting average childhood experiences and positive childhood experiences sort of on a continuum. And there are lots of reasons why that emerged. One of them is definitely because of the work of Jack Shonkoff and others around toxic stress, where he argues that there are really three kinds of stress situations. One is no stress. One is sort of tolerable stress, in which we encounter challenges and they cause us to grow. And then intolerable or toxic stress, which begins to trigger some of the biological conditions that we talked about today. And it is, I will tell you by way of background that the words toxic stress were developed by a PR firm for the purposes of getting folks, for purposes of community health education and trying to reach people and get traction. And one of the things that has come out of that is this idea that the continuum is actually from positive experiences to toxic stress experiences, and that there's a continuum, and that what we need to do is stack up experiences along the positive end of the continuum in order to sort of outweigh ACEs. And I think there's a lot of value in that, and I don't think kids can have too many positive experiences, just like kids cannot have too much love, for sure. There isn't at this time particularly good evidence that suggests that positive experiences in childhood can reverse or undo the kinds of biological mechanisms that we've talked about. There's not really evidence that suggests that these things can be balanced. So, for example, in my own dissertation, what I found was that I looked specifically at belongingness at school and feeling connected at school, which is a very important protective factor in the research for a variety of social outcomes. But when we drill down past sort of the generic research into looking specifically at a population of kids who had experienced maltreatment in their childhoods, we found that it was not nearly as protective for those kids as the numbers would suggest when you put the whole population together. And what we found is that in adulthood, in young adulthood, we still saw anxiety occurring as would be predicted by the ACE study. And we didn't see less anxiety. What we saw is when you evaluate for anxiety, there are two scales. There's a scale for symptoms of anxiety, and then there's a scale for well-being. And that well-being scale sort of controls how severe, how frequent, how persistent the anxiety is. So the anxiety was still in full force, but the well-being scores were higher. So what we would expect is that the anxiety would have shorter duration, maybe be a little bit less severe, and appear with less frequent episodes. And that finding actually replicated some other mental health findings that have come out of Teicher's lab at McLean Hospital. So right now, I guess the answer is kids should have all the positive experiences that we can generate for them. And the evidence, there's not really good evidence to suggest that positive experiences undo the biological mechanisms underlying ACEs. So that leaves us in a space where we do have to care really a lot about prevention.
Okay, do we have time for one more quick question from the audience or comment?
Sure.
All right, I'm not hearing any at this point. So that we will go ahead and end today's session. Thank you, Siwen. Thank you, Krista, for presenting. Very enlightening. Best of luck on the new lab you have going on with Dr. Karinji. Hope to hear some more updates and reports back on that. And just as a reminder, we have Public Health Seminar Series again next Monday at 2 p.m. with Carla Bird here from the University of Montana. So until then, thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.